I want to walk you through a cool example of applying Sims to a real boss fight to make some decisions about talents and some things that we can learn about the spec as a result. So on Sarkareth, you can sort of divide the fight into these four components. There's sort of P1 and parts of P2 and P3 where you're only fighting Sarkareth. This happens for something like 4 minutes of combat time, which isn't fully continuous, but we can treat as roughly continuous. And I think if you run some estimations, maybe you think the error bars in this are pretty small. There's some points in P2 where you're fighting 7 targets with all the recollection and glimmer spawns at once after the breaths. And I think this happens for something like 40 seconds of combat time based off of logs. There's times for fighting 2 targets after recollection or after the glimmers die and there's only the recollection left. And then there's some times in P3 where you're fighting 4 targets. So one thing we can do is construct some sims that model these situations. And so the things I've chosen are sort of 20-second sims with cooldowns for Enhancement Shaman, for the 7 and 4 target situations where you basically have all your cooldowns up. Then there's 1 minute sims without any of your cooldowns, so that's no Primordial Wave, no Sunring, but with Elemental Spirits, to match the 2 target situations where like you just use your cooldowns, so maybe you have your wolves coming back up, but you don't have anything else. And then in 1 target, I'm just going to look at a 4 minute sim with a potion and with Bloodlust to represent the sort of rest of combat. This doesn't actually capture your haste buff that you get coming out of the intermissions, which is a legitimate factor that like maybe that haste affects the types of builds that you play, but we're going to ignore that for now. And then the thing we're going to look at is the performance in terms of priority target damage for 3 different builds. And we're going to use the Enhancement Shaman Funnel APL, which is pretty awesome. This is a sort of APL that no one else has. But because Enhancement Shaman does so much funnel damage, it's sort of custom configured for these kinds of situations where you have a lot of ads up and you want to look at the amount of damage you're doing to the primary target. And we're going to look at 3 builds. So number 1 is going to be our sort of default single target build, which is something like this, where you play Elemental Blast, you play Swirling Maelstrom, and that's it. The other one is going to be Crash Lightning and Elemental Blast. And then our final build is going to be this sort of generic AoE build where you play Crashing Storms, Swirling Maelstrom, and Crash Lightning. That's what we call B1. This is sort of our baseline AoE build. B2 is going to be the baseline sort of default single target, and B3 is going to be this build with Crash Lightning and Elemental Blast both, but dropping Swirling Maelstrom. I think there's a lot of interesting things here. So we look at our priority damage from all these sims in these target settings. We look at the DPS gain going from B1 as our baseline to each of the different builds. And then we take the weighted average of each of these situations, where the weight is sort of the amount of time spent in combat over the course of 6 minutes of combat, to come up with an estimate of how much damage to Sarkareth you gain if you switch to one of these builds. So here you see like going from your baseline AoE to your default single target build gives you 5,000 boss DPS over the course of the fight, or something like 2 million total damage. For going from your baseline AoE to Elemental Blast plus Crash Lightning is something like 3 million boss damage, or this is like 40 bips of Sarkareth's health over the course of the fight. I think these results themselves are pretty interesting. They're maybe not what I expected, but there's a lot to be learned by also digging into these individual sims themselves and digging through some of the results. One thing I found sort of really surprising to me was that in 4 targets, going from your pure AoE build with Crash Lightning to a build with Elemental Blast and no Crash Lightning is actually no change in boss damage whatsoever. I think before this, my model of the world was that like most of Enhancement's funnel comes from Ashen Catalyst, Hot Hands, and the haste buff off Primordial Wave. But there's this other component of really amped up Maelstrom generation from the Crash Lightning buff. And if an Elemental Blast build were to have good funnel, it would be on the back of this Maelstrom generation. Sort of that you sacrifice some of your generic AoE talents, but you have Crash Lightning, so you get to cast Elemental Blast like 3 times as often into your priority target, and that's where all your damage comes from. And this difference sort of shows like that's actually not true. Sort of all the things that you make up for in increased Maelstrom generation to cast Lava Burst in the generic AoE build is made up for in casting a heavier hitting spender less often into your priority target with the Elemental Blast build. That's kind of surprising. Now, obviously, like adding Crash Lightning just takes this up a ton. You get to do like 15,000 more priority target damage by swapping talents here. But the fact that you don't even lose anything was kind of surprising. Now, this is obviously looking at just priority target damage. So we can look at the sims themselves and see these are the 2 builds that we were actually looking at. And the AoE build does something like 70,000 more damage to the adds at the expense of 0 priority target damage. So that's clearly better than playing the Elemental Blast no Crash Lightning build if your goal is maximizing total damage. I think people have this weird conception of, or misconception about funnel damage overall, or it's sort of counterintuitive in that this might actually be a bad thing if the adds were going to die at a reasonable time anyway and didn't really pose a threat to the raid. You're actually kind of sad to see higher overall damage, in that it makes the adds die, in this case, 70,000 DPS faster, which means you have less time to actually funnel into the boss. We can sort of quantify that here because we have these combat time levers to fiddle with. You could say something like, if everyone in my raid is sending extra cleave GCDs into the big 7 target situations, how much boss damage do we lose from the enhanced not being able to funnel for longer? Maybe we say they send enough AoE that each set of adds dies 2 seconds quicker, which is really only like 2 GCDs. That's not that long. That means we spend 34 seconds of combat time with 7 targets. We go from 8k boss damage in our optimal scenario to something like 750. This isn't huge. Like, if you look at the actual boss damage overall number, sorry, that should be that. We're losing something like 100,000 boss damage overall, which is small. But I think you should place this in context of your other beliefs about the game. If you're someone who cares a lot about regemming, like re-enchanting your rings for optimal stat weights, when these things grant like hundreds of DPS maybe, not thousands, then you should consider like, hey, am I killing these adds too quickly for our enhanced shaman to lose the amount of boss damage that I gained by regemming, right before raid? I don't know. There's certainly this is sort of dominated by the fact that you're just not in combat with these adds for that long. But if there were a situation where people are sending enough AoE to kill each of these sets like 5 seconds faster, then you're losing, hundreds of thousands of damage, which is not trivial. It's not the most, but in terms of the optimizations that people make, I think this is like close to a real one. Some people will care about choosing the optimal PI target when it's like a 2,000 DPS difference over a 15 or whatever second buff. It's like, that's clearly less valuable than this. And this is something people don't think about that often. I think the other thing that's interesting to look at here is the variance of these distributions. So one reason people often give for playing the AoE build over something with Elemental Blast is that you reduce your variance a lot. Like if you play EB, you can get really quite unlucky. You roll the crit buff instead of mastery, and then you roll bad dogs, and you're just in pain, and you don't get any maelstroms, you don't get to cast ever. So it's a theory you can have. I think this isn't actually borne out in the data. So if you look at something like, this is our AoE build from these talents. It has Crashing Storms. This is our Elemental Blast with Crash Lightning build. Here's the distribution. We can scroll down to the statistics and look at some summary statistics about priority target damage and see, hey, standard deviation here for the AoE build is like 25k on a mean of 200k, whereas here it's like 30k on a mean of 225k, which means something like, your eighth of a Steve unlucky elemental blast pull, which is like 40th percentile, is just as good as your median pull with the AoE build. Something else that you can look at is like 5th percentile. These are about the same, which means every 20 pulls, like, you just can't, you're not doing that much worse. Sorry, you aren't doing worse with the elemental blast build. Even though the Steve is higher, like, you make up for this slightly higher Steve by a much higher mean. So even if your distribution is like a little wider, this sensation that people have about the build being more sensitive to RNG doesn't seem to bear out in the data. Something else that's interesting to look at is the non-priority target damage. Obviously, you care a little bit about ad damage, especially if if your composition is something like 3 demo warlocks and 2 unholy decays, you're probably good on boss damage, and you might actually run a real risk of the ads going immune, and not being able to interrupt their casts, or if your raid group is less coordinated, then the longer the ads are alive, maybe the more likely it is that they get a cast off. So you can look at something like, how much extra damage am I doing? The other reason you might care about this is that on a fight similar to Starkreth, but with more deadly ads, you might actually care about your ad damage a little bit, and you want to know, like, how much am I trading off in terms of ad damage for priority target damage? So here with the AoE build, we see we do 300k damage to the ads and 200k damage to the main target for something like 500k overall. With the elemental blast build, it's something like 240k to the ads, 220k to the main target for 460k overall. The net effect is that you trade something like 60k damage to ads to 20k damage to the boss. I think this is pretty straightforwardly good in terms of a trade, but there are certainly fights or versions of Starkreth where this isn't good, and it's interesting to know that this is the exact trade-off you're making. These have been a couple of the random observations I had looking at some of these plots. I don't know how much you personally expected, or the values that you were expecting to see for some of these simulations. I was kind of surprised in that I played the AoE build for progression, mostly for these seemingly erroneous reasons that I gave, that I thought it was lower variance. I thought that in P1, the extra Maelstrom generation meant that you got to cast Primordial or Feral Spirits more, and that made up for the lack of Elemental Blast damage. I think that's just those were just actually erroneous. Like, you gain so much priority target damage in the funnel situations that it's just correct to play EB with Crash Lightning if you're sort of playing for boss damage and playing for a kill. And I think that's the state that most guilds are in, that they just don't really struggle with the miniature ads. And so even if you're not struggling for boss damage, you can send this damage into the Empty Recollection and translate that into boss damage. And I didn't expect the differences to be this big. There's something like, if you're doing 100k boss damage on Starkreth, which is a reasonable parse even this late into farm, this is like a 10% difference in the amount of boss damage you do on Enhance. 40 bips of boss health that you can gain by switching builds. I didn't expect the magnitude of the effect to be this large. So I think it was an interesting applied example for using some more finely grained sims, playing with the custom APLs a little bit in a way that wasn't really too daunting for someone with minimal simcraft experience, to gain some real insight into our class and better understand the exact things that are going on behind the scenes. Now, as a little postscript, I also ran some of these numbers for cleave builds. This would be something like, I'm playing the Storm build, and I'm going to drop some points in Elemental Assault and maybe Storm Blast for Crash Lightning and Converging Storms. And something you might not think about is like, how much of a difference is there between these various cleave builds? Like, what do you think the DPS of this is going to be to a party target in 7-target cleave? The answer is it's fucking atrocious. This build does like 130k damage to a party target. That's, no matter if you move your points in Elemental Assault around, you can drop elemental weapons and like put them back in Elemental Assault and Storm Blast. It doesn't matter. These variations all do 130k party target damage, and not as much add damage as the elemental builds, which is like really shockingly bad. Just how inflexible the Storm build is for cleave. I think some reasons that you can sort of give to justify this result. You don't spend at 10 on the Storm build anyway. Like, you just hit Storm Strike, so gaining extra Maelstrom from Crash Lightning doesn't do anything for you. Like, you already weren't spending your Elemental Blast, so being able to spend it more, who cares? That doesn't matter. Your Feral Spirits uptime is already 80% or something, like 83% with Storm. So getting more Maelstrom to have higher uptime isn't super valuable. Like, you already have it for most of your most important damage events. And your Feral Spirits is a relatively weaker cooldown because you don't take Elemental Spirits. You're only getting like 15% physical damage and some Maelstrom generation, so it's not that useful. Things like extra Storm Strike resets from the maintain attack of Crash Lightning just aren't that useful because Sundering gives us a lot of extra mastery to proc Stormbringer, and the build just has a lot of built-in Storm Strike resets already. Like, you play 60% mastery, something absurd. So, in prior seasons, getting Storm Strike resets was maybe much more valuable than it is now, and getting these extra ones from this cleave build are just not that useful. I don't know. I thought all these things were interesting. They give you a lot deeper understanding of how enhancement works as a spec, the sort of sources of its funnel. Hopefully you learn something about the spec and maybe can apply this sort of simulation approach to your own build.